You look at that appointment and I think it makes a degree, you can see why it makes sense on its own terms. One, it sends an immediate signal that he's serious on defence spending, and it sort of answers a lot of questions about what he thinks about the world beyond the East Lancs Road and regional inequality and all of that sort of stuff. The second thing is it is not a divisive appointment. He is respected by soft left, has always had, as one of his friends said to me yesterday, a foot in the soft left and a foot of the old right of the Labour Party. Old school union man, was in the Treasury under Gordon Brown, so knows how to exercise or how a successful Treasury operation exercises grip and drives through a very clear political agenda. And he's very widely respected as, someone said to me yesterday, senior diplomat said they're the most effective minister they have worked with in this Labour government, which I thought was striking, because if you ask a lobby journalist, say, "Oh, John Healey, bit underwhelming, only cares about defence spending," but he has a reputation for competence on Whitehall. So, I think you can see why they picked him, even though it bamboozled lobby journalists. And I think there was some degree of quiet satisfaction about that in number 10 yesterday.
I mean, he looked, Lara, like the cat that got the cream yesterday. It's worth reflecting that John Healey has been at loggerheads with the Treasury. It's been a really bitter row that led to his resignation over defence spending. Now he's in charge of it. He's got the whole thing. And that resignation letter that he wrote to Keir Starmer, which everyone is repeating now, was spectacular on several levels.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the reasons why, though it's not a kind of overtly divisive kind of appointment, it is for some Starmer loyalists, actually, who are, I think, of a more conspiratorial mind perhaps, actually quite a worrying appointment insofar as they think that Andy Burnham is surrounded by people who, to some degree or another, they believe had a hand in bringing Keir Starmer down. And of course, those close to John Healey would completely deny that. I mean, I think it's interesting. I remember interviewing John Healey in his final weeks as Defence Secretary when they were still trying to get the Defence Investment Plan over the line. He was pushing really, really hard behind the scenes and, coming up against a number of obstacles to get that money over the line. And it was just as Andy Burnham was emerging and was standing in that Makerfield by-election. And he made a real point early on to say, yes, I'll be up in Makerfield campaigning for Andy Burnham. And I think that speaks more to what Patrick is saying, which is essentially that, he's a party man. He's served multiple different Labour leaders continuously and sees himself as somebody who acts, in the service of the party. And I think that's what they will have been hoping for when they appointed him.
It's interesting. He has an almost identical line on that to Andy Burnham himself, right? Who was on the Labour opposition front bench continuously from 2010 to 2024. It was John Healey, right? He was a mainstay of Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinets, right? And Andy that's the argument Andy Burnham always makes, which is, I serve the leader of the Labour Party. I'm not into factionalism, right? So in some respects, in that key political respect, John Healey is appointed in his own image. I
think one of the challenges it presents is it effectively puts a defence-shaped fiscal bomb under this premiership in the same way that Starmer had to deal with. And what do I mean by that? I mean two things. First of all, just to kind of keep up with Keir Starmer's limited defence spending plans, he's got to find £4.7 billion in cuts or tax rises in the budget. That is doable. I imagine they will find that, right? But there is a much bigger problem, which is in that resignation letter, he explicitly said that defence spending should rise to 3% by 2030. It is there in black and white. And that was one of the main reasons that he resigned. Now, Andy Burnham has not signed up to that. Andy Burnham has signed up to the Defence Investment Plan, which gets them to 2.7% by 2030. And that is a huge fiscal gap. Just to give you some idea, there is an overall commitment to hit 3.5% by 2035, right? Now, what does that mean in pounds and pence? That is an extra £25 billion a year, equivalent to a 3p rise in income tax. So there is a risk here that you have put someone who is so on the front foot over defence spending, has put that so much at the centre of their political identity, and they are now in charge of the Treasury coffers. So if he doesn't do that, then there is going to be blowback and there's going to potentially be criticism. If he just sticks with the current profile of 2.7%, then there is going to be issues over that. So at the moment, it feels, I'm sure it feels very good and is a clear symbol of a commitment to defence spending, but actually getting there is going to be really hard. And it was so hard, it actually was a key factor in ending Keir Starmer's premiership. It means disregarding other spending priorities, other political priorities. It means putting defence at the centre of everything. And the US wants us to do that. We had a letter from, an opinion piece from Warren Stevens, the US ambassador, saying you should do that, deprioritise other things. But that is going to be hard for Andy Burnham to do.
Yeah, it will be. And it also means what he said to you in the Rose Garden yesterday, Steve, about flexibility within the existing fiscal rules is even more significant, because there is more flexibility in the fiscal rules. People forget this about Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules. They say, they were so restrictive, day-to-day spending, we're having to make these cuts. Actually, they were really expansionary on the question of capital investment. Another thing Darren Jones would be able to tell us about, actually, because as Chief Secretary of Treasury, he was responsible for a massive expansion in infrastructure investment under those rules. But there's also capacity to use sort of new government-backed financial institutions, National Wealth Fund and others to ramp up government borrowing. And John Healey was also an advocate, and this idea was very, very quickly shot down by Rachel Reeves and Starmer, of war bonds as well, to which economists would say, if Paul Johnson of the IFS was on this podcast with us, he'd say that's just new borrowing under a different name. But do we see that idea come back? Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, a big fan as well of the DSRB, as it's known, which is that kind of Canada-backed multilateral defence bank that they're trying desperately to get off the ground. It was always behind the scenes. The MOD were really keen to push that being an option. So I think they'll be looking at other creative ways like that as well. But let's see if that comes
the
through.
prize of your John Healey is to solve the problem, the political problem and the fiscal problem the Treasury never let you do when you were Defence Secretary, which is how do we move a chunk of defence? If we're going to have to increase defence spending, can we do it off the books somehow? Can we join with international partners to do that?
And will the markets buy that?
Yeah, exactly. But by the way, if he can do that, then that is a complete game changer for the rest of the government's fiscal picture. But let's see. The proof will be in the pudding of this one.
So we should turn to what comes next. Today we've had energy bills and a cut in that. We think bus fares is coming later this week. Return to the £2 cap. It'd be interesting to see how that's funded and what the plans are for that. And then you had a really good scoop, Lara, on Sunday about Thames Water.
Yeah, so obviously we know Andy Burnham has made no secret of the fact that greater public control of utilities will be at the heart of his government. There have been different models that have been under consideration. One of those, and this is the one that I'm told they will be choosing for Thames Water particularly, is special administration. So a special administration regime, as it's known, which I think commonly is understood as a kind of bankruptcy waiting room, so to speak, but does sort of...
public control.
Yeah, does indicate that it doesn't need to be permanent, does indicate that they don't currently feel that a deal with the creditors is necessarily viable at this point. And so I think you can definitely expect something very early on Thames Water in that space. It does, of course, beg the question about what they'll do with regards to other utilities. So let's see how that pans out.
It's also one of those things that actually is hugely complex and hugely challenging,
really
right? So your piece pointed out that I think you had the head of Thames Water pointing out, well, if you do this, the taxpayer is on the line for £2.5 billion just to keep Thames Water operating this year. It's expensive, right?
Yeah, and I mean, Team Burnham would say that would say, that 2.5 billion, it doesn't currently exist. It's, it's not like we're saying we're just going to take that from the taxpayer. They would say, actually, we don't believe that there's any viable way in which we can trust this company and they're going to be able to deliver that. And so actually, either way, the taxpayer is on the hook for something here. And we believe that actually the government having a form of control over this is a much better model than otherwise. Now, obviously, the creditors and the quote that you read in that piece disputes that. And that's why I think this is going to be a really interesting fight over the coming months as to what exactly happens with that particular money. And then you speak to people, who've been working on this area for some time, particularly in the Starmer government, who will say, this is just all so complicated.
Where does that money sit on the books, though, Lara, right? Because that's 2.5 billion that is going to sit on the books and therefore is a government debt and therefore narrows your choices another way. That's the problem. The consequences flow and flow, don't they? Of
course. I mean, as with all of these things, they'll be making decisions. And I think this speaks to why the budget in particular, as you've mentioned, is going to be just so critically important for them to lay the mega budget, as we're going to call it, to lay these things out, because we are going to have these pledges this week, these kind of flurry of these announcements that we're already seeing are underway from Andy Burnham. We've got that summer tour that's coming further down the line. But then I thought it was very interesting, both in Patrick's interview with Lord Blunkett, a key mentor to Andy Burnham, and also in those words that David Blunkett gave to The Guardian as well, about what he'd been kind of urging Burnham, which was essentially, as I understand it, to kind of come out fighting at the beginning and then take a period to kind of step back and really think about what it is that you want to do and kind of come back fighting again, perhaps in the autumn. And I think that will be the big question, is just how much are they going to announce this summer and how much they're going to wait for to come in the autumn, basically.